Really delighted to meet you all. I'm sorry that we're not sort of all sitting in a room having biscuits and really having a good chat. What I'm going to do today is I've not got a PowerPoint, so I'm really sorry about that. But I just want to talk about some things that sort of occur to me as I'm thinking about this big subject, funerals and culture. And I was a bit daunted in thinking about it, but then I thought, no, there's some interesting things that we can sort of like explore within this particular subject. Um, in my view, funeral expression is an aspect of broader sort of cultural expression. Often when we talk about funerals, we tend to see funerals in its own little bubble, that funerals just happen in a bubble and other things that sit outside that don't matter so much. But actually, I think we should maybe spend more time thinking, looking across and thinking about what's happening within funerals and how it relates to other different things that are happening societally and in people's lives. So I'm going to sort of like be talking about that a little bit. So let's just talk about basic definition. Let's look up Google. Let's see what it says about culture. This is what we're going to start with. So culture, what are we talking about? So culture is a shared system of beliefs, customs, values, language. It's a way of life. And I've talked about belief straight away, but I'm not going to be talking today about different belief systems because other sort of like presentations have talked about that. What I'm talking about more generally is kind of the general societal understanding of that's kind of the way that we do things. It's a sort of a general sort of understanding of what's acceptable. And I think I want to give an example. It's an example that's really sticks in my mind because I found it so intriguing. So I'm an academic and I've had a visiting academic come from Macau. So I've had a guy from China who's been in the department for a while and we've spent some time together. And we were waiting for a bus. So we were waiting for a bus together. And he said, can I ask you a question? It was always very awkward when he said, can I ask you a question? Because you didn't know where he was going to go from there. And sometimes he went to some awkward places. But anyway, he said, can I ask you a question? He said, at school, when children are at school, when are they taught about where they're supposed to sit on the bus? And I said, well, in what way? And he said, well, everybody always sits next to the window. And I said, oh, okay. We don't get taught where to sit on the bus, and we don't get sort of, we just do that because we want to make space for the people. That's just what we do. And he was saying, oh, okay. And he found that a little bit mystifying, and I thought that was really interesting because what it did is kind of like really made clear to me the norms that we kind of accept as being this is just what happens. We don't get taught how to do things. We look around other people, we see that's what they do, and we kind of just follow it. So that's, when we're talking about norms, that's the kind of thing that we're talking about. And actually, it's quite awkward sometimes not to be fulfilling a norm that's not a requirement. I was looking on I don't know, some YouTube thing the other day, and there was a picture of a woman who'd very clearly spread herself out all over the bus, decided nobody was going to sit next to her. Big photograph taken of her. She was on YouTube saying, look at this entitled Karen who's not playing to the rules. So there's some big sort of like consequences of not playing to the norm rules because you're seen to be in some way just simply not fitting in and not doing the right thing. But the thing about norms that's really interesting is they're not static. So they're not always the same. And that does tend to get a little bit scary in terms of, what are the norms, how are the norms changing? And I think norms are generational. There's norms that happen with people that are my age, and they're very different from the norms that happen with people who are in their 20s and younger. So norms do change, and they change kind of over time. And what's interesting for me as a person who sits in death studies, so that's where I am as an academic, is that death studies has come up as a subject as a consequence of a big societal shift in norms around mortality. And it's come as a consequence of criticism of the norms that are associated with mortality that had started to develop and emerge through the course of the 20th century. And there's two or three threads within that sort of development, what happened during the course of the 20th century. So first, there was a big kind of like critique and understanding, a recognition that all of the rituals surrounding death had somehow become impoverished. So that the rituals that we could look to when death took place, they were starting to become slightly smaller, slightly less stated. And this observation comes from an anthropologist called Geoffrey Gorer. And he wrote a really influential book in 1965 called Death, Grief and Mourning. Massively influential book. And he talks about his own experiences within his family about societal attitudes, how they surrounded his own experience. So his father actually died on the Lusitania. His father died in 1915, right in the middle of the First World War. His mother, dressed in widow's weeds, completely covered in black, lots and lots of different rituals in the neighbourhood. People would draw down their blinds, and people would visibly see that his mother was in mourning, as very, very many women were at that time during the First World War. And as time went on, the mourning tradition, the mourning garb changed slightly so that people would get an understanding of where you were kind of within your grief journey. It was very visible to people. And he contrasted this with his later experience. So he talked about his brother Peter. And in the 1960s, his brother Peter was given a terminal diagnosis. He had a terrible cancer, and he died. And when his brother died, Geoffrey Gora was devastated. But all of his sympathies were with his brother's wife. His brother's wife couldn't bring herself to go to the crematorium. The children didn't attend the crematorium funeral at all. They became very isolated. He said, this is what he wrote at the time. He said, at the period when she most needed help and comfort from society, she was left alone. So people would cross the street, not talk to her because they didn't know what to say. So in his view, that was a societal shift that was really problematic. So what Gora said was death had become some kind of taboo. It was a societal sort of shrinking away from talking about the dead, from talking about grief. And the whole notion that we don't talk about death nowadays, that comes from Geoffrey Gora's work, who identified that as being the case in the 1960s. And it's a theme that's still sort of prevalent nowadays. Another element of critique related to the way that medical professionals dealt with imminent death. So here the principal criticism comes from Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and I know that there are people in this room that are much, much more expert about Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's contribution. So Gora had mentioned that when his brother Peter was diagnosed with an incurable cancer, an extensive cancer, he had just days, weeks to live. The doctors and Peter's wife both decided that Peter shouldn't be told about it. They said he shouldn't be told. And Kubler-Ross was very, very heavily critical of this approach. And we're all familiar with the notion of 5 stages of grief. It's something that's talked about quite a lot, but actually it's really something that applies specifically to people who've been told that they've got a terminal diagnosis. And it's a recognition that it takes some time for people to come to terms with the fact that they are going to die, and they need to be engaged with that process. So what Kubler-Ross wanted to see was a process that put the individual at the centre of that decision making, not at the margins. And she was a pioneer in promoting the notion that the dying should be granted a degree of agency about the decisions that were made, about their care and about how they would want to end their lives. So that's another sort of second element of criticism. A third element of criticism, and there's a number of criticisms coming up here. The third element of criticism relates ironically to the welfare state. People don't talk very much about the impact of welfare state on mortality, but actually it had a massive impact on mortality. The introduction of a system of national hospitals meant it became increasingly likely that people would not die at home, they would die in the hospital. So many social commentators were really quite critical of this displacement. It felt that the dead were dying alone. Traditionally, death had taken place at home, within the family, within the community, where everybody was aware that somebody was dying. Once death had taken place, the local women in the community, a particular individual would come and help lay out the body. The body would be placed in the coffin, usually in the front room, the best parlour, and the neighbours would come and pay their respects. So the whole of the community was involved in that particular kind of dying experience. Dying in hospital, under the care of professionals, literally distanced people from their dying friends and relatives. It became less and less likely that people even saw a dead body at any time in their lives. Society lost that kind of authentic engagement with mortality. So that was a kind of third level of critique. And this term professional creeps up in a kind of another level of criticism. Death care, all elements of death care, were thought really to be best placed with professionals. People who had professional practices, rules, frameworks, outcomes, key performance indicators, all of which placed death in a really fixed frame which became very difficult. It was really difficult for bereaved people to penetrate that frame. They had no space within that whole government of death. The professionals were regarded as the people who were best placed to make all the right decisions, because those decisions reflected the best use of resources, the most efficient way of doing things, the best way of managing things. So the big example that we might want to draw on here is cremation. Cremation, by far the most efficient way of dealing with the dead. It meant the dead take up less space. Cremation services could be over in 20 minutes, and people could be moved smoothly through the crematorium system, one family after another, with maximum efficiency. And people lost really any kind of element of choice. And then a final element of critique relates to commercialism. So death became the purview of professionalised funeral directors, apparently ever more adept at screwing the last penny out of a grieving widow. And this is a narrative very, very strongly voiced in the 1960s by Jessica Mitford, whose book, The American Way of Death, massively, massively popular at the time. And she was very clever, actually, because it was very funny. So it's a very funny read, massively, massively critical. And she updated it in the 1980s. So it became sort of, it stayed sort of like relevant. It lampooned the advertising techniques, coercive techniques that were being used by funeral directors to persuade people to spend rather more than they perhaps would want to on the funeral. And it was a critique really of funeral directing in the US, but it was picked up without really much in the way of sort of like analysis, and then just applied to the UK funeral industry must be pretty much the same. So this critique of commercialism also crept into this notion. So all of these different themes together amounted to a kind of a multi-pronged attack on funeral culture by the end of the 20th century. Certainly by the 1980s, considerable dissatisfaction was being expressed, that funeral rituals offered no consolation, that people who were dying had no say in how they were treated, that professionals medicalised mortality and created frameworks of governance that excluded the bereaved and excluded the dying, and that funerary practice was becoming more and increasingly empty, just an expression of capitalist exploitation. So this is where we are in understanding this is what our funeral culture looks like, what it looked like in the 1980s, kind of 1990s. And these were changes that were taking place in the context of other big societal changes, which were reducing people's ability to draw on other resources for consolation. So fewer people were part of formal religious organisations. They weren't attending churches anymore. They weren't part of religious denominations where there were rituals that offered spiritual hope and comfort. So they'd kind of lost that mooring a little bit. Communities no longer appeared to have a role in offering support to the bereaved. And welfare systems offered limited help for people with funeral costs. And we became increasingly reliant on the market for solutions. So increasingly, the view was that you sorted this out for yourself. The state has no role here. And that whole notion that the state has no role in this summarises our current sort of like societal culture, which academics have called neoliberal. So we're sitting in a neoliberal frame where the presumption is that the state plays a very, very limited role in people's societal kind of interactions, and that we're all responsible for meeting our own needs. There's a word I can't. There's responsibilization is the word that they often use, which means we're all responsible for dealing with our own needs ourselves. And this means that we're all under pressure to make the right choices for ourselves. So that's kind of where we got to. So academics have played a role, and other lobbyists have played a role in recognising a distinctive British way of death, and not a great British way of death, that you could see at the turn of the 21st century, and focusing discontent on that. But that critique has started to break that down. So we're now in a situation where those criticisms are starting to be addressed, and we're starting to move in a different direction. And I think it's really interesting because this is where we are at the minute. It's evident that our death culture is shifting. So we're sitting in a time of change, and that's always very interesting to watch. I'm a historian, I love change. It's always interesting to see. So our death culture is shifting. And there's been a growth as what's been termed the death positive movement. And here I'm talking about initiatives and ideas that aim to create a more positive engagement with mortality. So they're trying to sort of unpick the old death culture and try to recreate another kind of death culture. And the kinds of things that people are looking towards is encouraging people to discuss death more openly, holding death cafes so people can talk about their own experience of mortality and their experience of bereavement. Empowering the bereaved so that they can be more closely engaged with caring for dead family and friends, so they're not distanced by the operation of funeral directors. Promoting the notion that death is a natural part of life and that we should decide for ourselves the ritual activities that offer the greatest consolation when somebody dies. So our funeral culture currently is changing in response to the overwhelming critique that was directed towards the second half of the 20th century. But I think the interesting thing that we need to think about at the moment is about how it's changing. And I wonder whether we're starting to engage with creating another and similarly rigid set of rules about how people should respond to mortality. So this is what I want us to discuss today. So this year's Dying Matters Awareness Week focused on culture and death, quite interestingly. And this recognised that we live in a society constructed of people with a range of inherited traditions. We live in a mixed society. This is who we are as British people. And religious beliefs have framed different sets of rituals and ways of understanding mortality. And it's really important that we have those discussions of that kind of difference. But I think in some ways it encourages us to start ordering people into silos with tick boxes of this is what they do differently. All these people, they do things differently. Let's just say, they do this bit differently and that bit differently. I think sometimes it's more challenging to try and think about all of this notion of difference in a kind of a different way. I want to ask today whether we can start to recognise other kinds of differences that cross cultural boundaries. And the material I want to draw on is work that I did with Sarah, which was published in 2019. So Sarah sort of mentioned that right at the beginning. And I'm hoping that she'll put a reference to this report in the chat, Funeral Experts by Experience. And this, for me, was a massively, massively important piece of work because it helped me much, much better understand all of the different kinds of responses to the need to create a funeral, all of the different kinds of responses that were possible. All of us face the same challenge when somebody close to us died. And the challenge is working out how on earth we can deal with what's happened. I think that in every circumstance and within every cultural frame, we're all seeking a level of consolation appropriate to the pain that we're feeling. We want consolation to deal with our pain at whatever level of pain that is. I'm not going to make any presumptions about that. And I think funerals are the one place where the search for consolation becomes palpable. It becomes obvious to other people what kind of actions you are taking. I think we all might agree that it's wrong for any agency to be prescriptive about how other people seek consolation. But it's really hard not to be judgmental in the face of difference. And I want to talk today about 3 aspects of funerary culture. And this is just illustrative. This is just to get us discussing this fact. 3 aspects of funerary culture where it's really challenging to accept the choices that other people make. This is what I want to talk about for the rest of the session today. So I want to talk about 3 different kind of themes that I think are quite interesting and that I think actually offer some reflection on the kinds of judgments that people might make. I'm going to talk about people who lean in, people who lean back when it comes to the funeral. I'm going to talk about people who express by spending and people who express by doing. And I'm going to talk about people conforming and not conforming. Now, automatically in me creating these kind of like dichotomies, you might already sort of be thinking, yes, there's some ways in which you should be doing these things. There's things that look more appealing to me at the minute. But one thing that I've learned from very, very many years of dealing with funerary practice is that society is very, very, very quick to make judgments about other people's choices. These modes that I've talked about can be seen as dichotomies where one seems to be the opposite to another and one set of responses seems to be the right one. But I'm going to try, and I think this is quite interesting, I'm going to talk about these different choices without any judgment at all, and see what that gets to. See where we get to with that. See if we can kind of understand a little better. I think, and also reflecting on these sort of funerary kind of like narratives, which were very, very interesting. So first, the notion of leaning in and leaning back. Leaning in, leaning back, what am I talking about? I think death positivity, the thing about death positivity, it kind of doesn't want to acknowledge that some people will find death very difficult. They lean back away from death. They don't want to engage with it. They want to make funeral arrangements possibly with as little fuss as possible. They just want to get it over. And arguably, the direct funeral movement reflects the whole culture of a generation of people, possibly the baby boomer people, who are not necessarily engaged with death positivity as a thing. They want, there's so many people that were talked about in these interviews that say, oh, my nan, she said, just put me out with the bins. I don't want any fuss. Just I don't want any fuss about it at all. They don't want any kind of engagement when death comes knocking. And I think it's interesting to try and understand that attitude a little bit. And I wonder whether we could spend more time thinking about it. So one thing that I think is really interesting, that people tend not to think about, and I think we should think about it a bit more, is the fact that some people really are very superstitious. So one really interesting paper that I attended once, it was talking about why people don't take out funeral plans. And one of the responses is, well, it's tempting fate though, isn't it? It's tempting fate to take out a funeral plan, you're dead tomorrow. So let's just not. You know, they're really quite superstitious. They don't really want to think about death because it might bring it on. And that's quite an interesting way of seeing the world. I think if somebody feels it's tempting fate to talk about death, then who are we to maybe push them into a decision making about it that they're really not very happy with? I think sometimes superstitions, they reflect very visceral attitudes towards things, and I think they should be respected. And I think that's quite interesting to think about, is what do we do about people's superstitions? I think the other thing is that's really interesting is some people really don't find funerals particularly important. They don't find them particularly comforting. It's like some people don't do birthdays. Everybody's got people in their family. They just don't do birthdays. You know, they wouldn't dream of sending a Valentine's card. Rituals are just not their thing. And I think the man that sticks in my mind, and Sarah's very used to me talking about him, is the man who really didn't want to be bothered with arranging his father's funeral. He wasn't really concerned about it. He didn't really want to do it, but he did it because he knew his relatives would find it strange if he didn't. He said, none of the funeral makes any difference to me. The thing that was really important was I held my father's hand when he died. After that, nothing was really important. All of the other rituals, he said, it's just nothing, it doesn't mean anything to me. So he had a really interesting reason for thinking that funerals were very immaterial to his way of thinking about the world. And I think it's interesting that actually we don't ask people very much about the decisions that they make about funerals. And I think it's really important that we don't make any presumptions about the decisions that people are making, because you know what, we're not in their heads. We don't know what they're going through. We don't know what they're going to find comforting. We don't know where they're coming from. So these are the decisions that they're making, and we don't necessarily understand them just by looking at what funeral is taking place. I think the other thing that I was pleased by, let me say, I was really pleased by the number of people that we interviewed, that when it came to the notions of looking at the body, they got the ick. They said, oh, no, I'm not, no, thank you. No, thank you very much. I don't want to see the body. I'm probably the most squeamish death studies scholar on the planet. I don't like hanging around with bodies very much. Must be said that my worst afternoon, I got trapped in a mortuary. I couldn't get out. I'm still thinking about it. I was sitting there, I was surrounded by lots of dead bodies thinking, this door is not opening. What do I do? So some people, you know, in being told that an authentic engagement might include then viewing the dead body, they're really not at all keen on that. And we actually interviewed a number of people as part of a second project that looked about care of the body after death. Really interesting to see some people just backed away from that. They really didn't want to talk about it at all. Other people, oh yeah, let's sort of like have this discussion, let's think about it. But some people, the material remains of the dead is something that they really don't want to be thinking about, don't want to be engaged with. That's who they are. And I don't think we should necessarily be critical of that. And finally, I think it's interesting to think about the relationship between the person who has died and the people who are arranging the funeral. We don't really know about that necessarily. We don't know what that relationship has been. I think another sort of case that really stuck in my mind was a woman who talked about the funeral of her husband, and I think it was a very, very small funeral. She'd gone with just her adult children, I think. And the celebrant was really kind of bemused because they were trying really hard to make it very personal, but the women wanted it to be as generic as possible, because that man had been a very abusive husband, a very abusive father. They were relieved that he was dead, and they wanted just to have a funeral that was as neutral and as cold as possible, because they didn't think he deserved anything better. And I think that's really another kind of interesting kind of reflection on how people might want to be seeing the funeral, how they want to be using the funeral, and what it says. And we can't kind of control for that. We don't know what people are going to do with the funeral, how they're going to use it to express themselves. So we don't know why people are making their choices. So some people might have quite valid reasons for kind of leaning back. But some people lean in. So we had many interviews with people who were definitely leaning into the funeral. They were really, really engaged with what a funeral might offer. And that included active participation with body care after death, quite elaborate funeral ceremony with lots of multiple elements in it that draw in lots of different family members to do different kinds of contributions. So leaning in seems to express many things. It expresses a really strong desire to get things right in multiple ways, a strong desire to make sure that the funeral is saying the right things about the person who died, but also saying the right things about the family that's left behind. And also there's an element of gifting often when people lean in, of giving the person who died some level of acknowledgement about who they were, why they were loved, and why they might be missed. And it's possible to argue that this is a preferable approach. But I think we have to also acknowledge that leaning in is also expressive of relational activity outside the context of the funeral. So people who lean in might be the kind of people who routinely are using rites of passage and life events to express themselves. This is just who they are. Their Christmases start in mid-November. They've got everybody pegged for a different kind of secret Santa. The weddings have a spreadsheet. They've got flowers coordinated with the bridesmaids' shoes. It's just the way they like to do things. They really engage with event management, and that gets translated into their funerary practice. So I think it's really quite interesting thinking about people who are leaning in and thinking about the way in which they're leaning in and why they're leaning in. Might not necessarily relate specifically to this is a kind of a better way of doing things. It's a different way of doing things that might not necessarily be reflective of a better or worse attitudes towards mortality. It's just a different kind of approach. So it's something for us to think about, I think. A second thing I think relates to expenditure and how people deploy their resources when it comes to a funeral. I think if it's one big taboo, it would be, how much did you spend on the funeral? That's a terrible taboo. You just don't dream of asking that particular question. We don't really talk enough about spending money when it comes to funerals, because I think we all know what it means. I think we all think it's about vulnerable consumers who are exploited by funeral directors, and that's the only kind of theme we want to explore. We don't want to explore other ways in which people are thinking about what they spend on a funeral and why. If I had a research pot of money that's go and find out, I would say, okay, I'm going to find out. I'm going to ask people, why did you spend that amount? Whatever amount it was, why did you spend that amount? You know, what were the kind of decisions that you're making about all of these different things? Because we don't know that. We don't really know that very much at the moment. And I think it'd be good to find that out. I think there's lots of complicated things going on when it comes to this kind of thing. And again, it's helpful to adopt a kind of a wider lens to understand that funerary expenditure is probably very similar to people's attitudes towards expenditure in other parts of their lives. And I think this is absolutely true. People spend money in a way, and their spending on a funeral will reflect their other kinds of modes of spending. This is my kind of view. And it also it came out of the funerary interviews. There was one guy I kind of really remember. He said, and he was really frank about it. He was very kind of open about it. He said, you know what? I just spend money. I just spend money. It's just who I am. If he said that this was the top one, you know, I'll just buy it. That's who I am. It doesn't really matter. That's just how I express myself. And I think some people just express themselves by spending. Some people's identities and modes, their way of being in the world, is absolutely tied to how they spend their money. And that's not, that sounds like a very sort of artificial thing, but I don't think it is necessarily. I know a very, very warm, extended family, that absolutely beautiful family. Every single person gets something at Christmas. Every person and their dog gets a Christmas present at Christmas. And it's the way they have of expressing their love for each other. It's just who they are, and it's how they live their lives. And I think funeral expenditure is not necessarily thoughtless. I think it's still a mode of gifting where the intention is to get the gift exactly right, to choose the right coffin, to choose the right flowers. And that also included getting the level of expenditure right. So the other thing that I was really struck by was the number of people who said, yes, we were spending this money, but we were gauging it according to what our mother would have agreed with. She would have killed me, some people said. She'd have killed me if I'd wasted money on the coffin. It's just not who she was at all. We wouldn't have done that. It was interesting that people often, they chose the second least expensive coffin. It's like going for the wine that's one up from the bottom of the list when you're in a restaurant. You don't want to look really cheap, do you, by going for the really bottom one? But then you don't want to spend a fortune because it's still only wine, you know. Why go for the really expensive one? No point in throwing money away. So people were making, you know, quite canny choices around their expenditure. They weren't doing it thoughtlessly. So just spending money doesn't necessarily mean that people aren't thinking about what they're doing and what it means. And I think I want to go on a little sidebar here to talk about funeral poverty. So this is my sidebar on funeral poverty. And I think something really sort of struck me recently that made me think about funeral poverty kind of differently. And it was, I've been doing a lot of reading around African American funerary activity, funerary ritual. And it's really sort of like, it's really made me think about how people who are very, very marginalized in society, the decisions they make about their funeral expenditure. And it's not, in England, we're always talking about, oh, working class people, they spend too much because they want to be respectable. And I think that's just not true. That is absolutely not true. That's not what it's about. I think that families who've been marginalised through the whole of their lives, when it comes to a death, they want to take that one point to demonstrate to society this person is seen, this person hasn't been overlooked at this point, that they absolutely mattered, and then literally slowed down the traffic when they died. And I think that's massively important because the notion that that person was seen, really, really important to people when they've been sort of excluded and marginalised all of their lives. And I think it's another way of kind of trying to understand why some people might make the decisions that they do about the funerals that they purchase. It's not about status necessarily. It's about a way of demonstrating visibility to a culture that can be very dismissive. And I think that's something that we might give some thought to. But anyway, so that was my sidebar. So we might talk about that a bit later. That might be interesting. But some people also express by doing. So some people, they kind of like their way of being in the world is kind of like, you know what, why would I spend money on that? I can just do that. You know, why would I spend money on getting some person to do lots of sort of like, you know, orders of service? I've got a photocopier at work. I could do that at 6 o'clock when nobody's seeing. You know, they see themselves as, you know, they're laboring. They're expressing themselves by doing. They don't have a relationship with money that sees expenditure as important. In fact, they see saving money as being their kind of way of expressing their sort of relationship with money. And they kind of, you know, in some ways they're gifting through their emotional labor. So they're choosing the right music. They're making sure their loved one had the right outfit. They're picking the flowers they know that person loved. It's another way of seeking consolation. It's another mode of seeking consolation. So the third and final mode I want to talk about is about conforming and not conforming. And I think I want to put a big sort of like, again, sort of, you know, see what people think about it. But I think people find it very comforting to conform, to be honest. I think they want a funeral that they want to be dignified, appropriate, fitting, that other people sort of said, yes, that was exactly right for that person. They might want it to be a little bit different, but maybe not so different that it's unexpected or deemed to be wrong in some regard. It's like being very, you know, it's like being dressed for the right occasion. You know, there's nothing worse than turning up and, oh God, you know, I didn't realise the dress code was this. And then you're just awkward for the rest of the night because you know that you're not dressed properly. So some people find it very, very comforting to have the funeral in the right kind of way. It's comforting because it creates a sense of belonging or security. Echoing culturally learned behaviours, it reduces anxiety, getting it wrong is massively stressful, particularly if it means that getting it wrong means that other people are going to judge the funeral to be undignified, inappropriate, or unfitting. But it's got to be said that I think that death positive movement places immense pressure on people to not conform. So it brings a measure of anxiety with it, in my view. There is substantial pressure to be different. Although, actually, I think a lot of people are being different in the same way, and that's kind of interesting to talk about. So there's a lot of pressure to be different. So, for example, some people will be having a funeral as a celebration of life event. And then, I don't know, I wonder if there's increasing rules about what a celebration of life event should be looking like. So then you're creating some new kinds of norms, even though you're supposedly not conforming. People are creating bespoke their own bespoke funeral rituals, stepping outside the common frameworks. They might be creating their own circumstances, ways in which they're scattering cremated remains. So people are kind of trying to sort of find these things out for themselves. But not conforming brings its own pressures, its own anxieties, I think, that we should sort of maybe acknowledge that people, when it comes to a funeral, conforming is just much more comfortable. And, we'll just do what other people do because then, we don't want it to be an anxiety-making activity. So I think there's ways of looking at these things, I think, that are quite interesting. So what I've tried to demonstrate over this last sort of few minutes is that although we might say that we want to be inclusive of different funerary cultures, actually we tend to sit in judgment on lots of other people's choices. And what I've tried to sort of talk about is, we live in a neoliberal society. That's framed our funeral culture. There's been a falling away of all the boundaries that make it clear how things should be done. So we don't have religious institutions anymore that tell us the rituals we should use. We're questioning the authority of professionals. And so we're trying to create the funerals that are most likely to bring us comfort. But I think we've got to be aware of trends that signal that some funeral expressions are more valid than others. I think we've created space to talk about death, and this is really welcome. But we really should try and ensure that space is non-judgmental. In every funeral we attend, we're watching a family trying to cope. We're watching a family trying to grasp some level of consolation. Everybody's strategies are going to be different. And this means that if we're going to define a funeral culture, we should be aiming for a complete inclusivity. And that means accepting choices that we might not be making for ourselves.